When I think about, how I was before awakening, and how did I get here? How did I get here? I felt like I was so bound by my own pain and my own suffering. And so, so miserable. I mean, I would look out at the world and say, that's an inert, dead thing out there. How can this be? There has to be more. But who could imagine what that more was? It's like as a friend of Swamiji says, Swami Chaitanananda, he says it's an unimaginable possibility, because you can't imagine how life can be from the point of view of limitation and suffering. You can't imagine. I could not imagine that Shaktipat or Kundalini awakening or Guru's grace existed. I was very self-destructive as a young woman. Very self-destructive. I was on the path to darkness. There's no doubt. And then something happened where I said, okay, it's over. I had some kind of strength within me to say, I'm stopping this now. One night I had a dream. And in the dream, I was conscious, and I woke up and I could hear a bell ringing. And I was like in this other world where everybody was wearing white. And they were sitting on the floor kind of meditating and chanting, which I didn't even know what it was. They were making these sounds, which I now later realized they were mantras. And in the bell was like a voice that said, all right, change now. Do it now. And from that moment, my whole life began to change. I think you have to ask for help. I think it's like, all the NA and AA, what do they say? I need help. And then help came, and I started to meet a series. The first teacher I met was a therapist who helped me. Then he invited me to Italy, where he trained me in Gestalt therapy. And I was there studying for 2 years and running groups. And then there, I met my husband-to-be. He was from Ann Arbor, and then I met Baba, and then I met Swamiji. So from that moment, I met all these teachers who protected me and showed me a different way of being, which led to yoga. I lived in Italy, and then I went to America, and I did some tours in America teaching, doing workshops and things. And then I landed in Ann Arbor, which is where Swamiji had the ashram, and he had been sent away. And I picked up the newspaper one morning, and I read this in the newspaper. I read, meditate on yourself, worship yourself, love yourself, understand yourself. God dwells within you as you. I read that, and I looked, and I thought, God, that's an amazing message. What is that? And then my husband came home. He was going to grad school at U of M, and he said, we've been invited to meet a Swami. I said, what's a Swami? Ripley's Believe It or Not, the guy lying on nails, right? And he said, do you want to go? And I said, sure, why not? So a few days later, we pull up outside an old fraternity house, and it's got Siddha Yoga Dham written in big black letters across the top of it. And we walk in, and it's a room not much bigger than this room. And I look over from the doorway over there to my left, and there's this man in orange, all dressed in orange, sitting on a two-seater couch, and he's speaking, and he's apparently answering questions. And so I walk in and sit down, and as we sit down, our eyes meet, and I felt this welcome. So I sit down, and that's the last thing I remember. I touched a place so deep within me, and it was like sleep. I mean, I thought I had fallen asleep, but it was different, because I felt like this connection to something. I couldn't have described it if you had asked me, but I knew it was special. So I took an intensive. And it was that intensive that I again had the experience of Kundalini, a massive experience which radically altered everything in my life. So in one moment, which was the moment when Swamiji goes around and he blesses people with a wand of peacock feathers, that this explosion of electricity happened within me, where I just felt the most incredible sense of aliveness and connection to everything. Everything was moving. If I opened my eyes and looked out at the world, it was all vibrating with what they call chitti, or consciousness. And the world never looked dead again after that. The Sunday school teacher stands up and starts to give a lecture and says, you know, starts talking about sin, okay, and how children are sinful, and all. I don't know even what church it was, okay, and I was like, oh, wait a minute, you know, how can children be sinful? That was my thing, you know. I thought, there ain't no God here. And that's when I looked out the window and I thought, if God exists, God will be magical. Being able to name feeling is a huge step forward, because not everybody can do that. I couldn't do it. I had to learn. I mean, that's one thing that Gestalt taught me, was how to name my feelings. Because I used to think that I never got angry, you know. The Shakti is awakened and alive in, you know, the gurus of this tradition. You know, that Shakti, you learn to follow that Shakti and not the you know, tendencies of a negative mind. And Swamiji's demand is that you come in an open, loving state. It's sort of keeping a focus on both, a focus on the inner and then an awareness of the outer at the same time. And you know, being able to move between those two and hold that state without allowing the contraction to run the moment. That's a great gift, to discover what you can do. You know, I mean, I had to come to understand that what I can do is live in an ashram. I can live in an ashram, but I can't live in an apartment or a house, you know, with one other person or two other people. But I can live in an ashram, you know, and it's like a kind of self-acceptance to know what you can do. And that when you find that, when you discover that and accept that, then that thread of bliss is present, because you're doing your dharma, you know, you're doing your what the higher self or what your destiny or whatever is asking of you. And to find that is a great gift. My favorite game as a child was hide and seek. I used to love that game. And I mean, yoga and meditation is nothing but that. It's a game of hide and seek, where we hide things from ourselves and then we discover them and we look for them and then we find them, and then we're constantly moving from hiding, concealing things from ourselves and then discovering them. You know, concealing grace, discovering grace, concealing wisdom, discovering wisdom. I mean, how you know, Shiva in his perfect state, his perfect bliss, his perfect harmony, his perfect union, decides, you know, he's going to create many, give himself. He gives himself, right? And then the world is created. Oops. I like to say there's an impulse to become. You know, we want to become. I mean, from the first moment, you know, as a young baby, we want to walk, don't we? Then we want to run. Then we want to do this. Then we want to do that. We want to become. I think it is this inherent thing of becoming. What are we becoming truly? Hopefully we're becoming the self, or becoming Shiva, or returning to that state of oneness. That's really what we want to become. But along the way, you know, we get diverted into these, you know, other things. Yeah, I can become this and then I'll be happy, or I can become that and I'll be happy. But really what we want to become is we want to become ourselves. We want to feel that sense of completeness and integration in ourselves. I always believe that life has to come, our lives, you know, our careers, our relationships, everything has to come from the self. Not from some concept we have about how we think our life should be, or the person we ought to marry, or the person, this person or that person. That it has to evolve out of a sense of beingness. And then the choices we make and the decisions we make are based in that sense of selfhood. I keep thinking about the future. I think in 100 years, if I was born 100 years from now, because when I was born, when I was in my late teens, there were no yoga studios in Vancouver, nothing. So I think, in 100 years, if I'm reborn, there's going to be yoga studios everywhere, right? Well, each of us has to find, as I said, the thing they can do, because there's so many. If you look out at the world from a certain perspective and you see all the things that the world needs to heal itself, it seems impossible. And one person cannot do it. One politician cannot do it. But each of us can do what we can to contribute something positive. And I think that, if I was to look at the movement of my life, from feeling impotent to discovering what I can do to contribute, that's a massive thing. After I awakened, that was all I wanted to do, was to say thank you. To say thank you to God, to say thank you to the Guru, to say thank you for a possibility like that, where my life could turn from being a dead thing to an alive thing. There's a time for isolation. There's a time for people to be Swamiji talked about his time in Ganeshpuri, where he was isolated and cut off from the world. Well, I had a similar thing in my first 3 years in the ashram, which was in Ann Arbor. I hardly ever left the ashram. I was isolated to a certain extent, even though I was living in America. I was doing my practices and doing my sadhana very intensely. And so there's a period of isolation, which I think is healthy and good for everyone, but not as a way of life. People get hurt, and so, as they live their lives, and this hurt builds up into this feeling of, I want to get away from people, right? Because it's relationships with people that seem to bring up the most pain and the most hurt. So if I just take myself out of relationship with all the people, then I'll be just fine, right? So then the issue becomes, well, how do I live with people and deal with the pain that arises in this space that's between two people or three people or a family? How do I keep that space open? It's a sacred space when two people sit down and have a conversation, and it is, but it gets contaminated. So then how do we keep that space free of contamination and free of hurt? And when hurt arises, then how do we make it clear again?
I really thank you. Wow. Really nice to meet you. Nice to be in your home. I feel like I'm in your home and you're the mother,
Thank you.